In the winter of 1762, the most powerful woman in the world committed an act so depraved that Russian nobles covered their eyes in horror.
What you're about to discover about Catherine.
The Great will destroy everything you thought you knew about Imperial.
Russia, behind the golden walls of the Winter Palace.
Whispers echoed through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But on this night, those whispers would become screams. The Russian court had seen executions, assassinations and political purges. But what Catherine commanded that evening would haunt the nightmares of witnesses for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how an innocent German princess named Sophie became the most sexually depraved ruler in European history, and why her final act of perversion nearly triggered a revolution. Catherine's descent into madness began with her marriage to Peter III, a man so twisted that even the Russian court, accustomed to brutality, found him repulsive. But Peter's perversions would seem innocent compared to what Catherine would become within months of her arrival in Russia. Catherine realized that survival required more than political cunning. In the Russian court, power meant embracing the darkness that consumed everyone who dared to rule. Peter III's obsession with Prussian military games and his collection of life-sized dolls should have been warning signs. But the Russian court was too distracted by his other habits that involved
Animals and unthinkable acts.
As Peter descended deeper into madness, Catherine discovered something within herself, a hunger for power that would consume everything, including her humanity. The French philosophers she read spoke of enlightenment, but Catherine's enlightenment would lead to the darkest places of human desire. Sergei Saltykov was Catherine's first lover, a man who introduced her to pleasures that the German court had never imagined. But Saltykov was merely the beginning. What he taught Catherine about desire would evolve into something that defied all natural law. In the private chambers of the Winter Palace, Catherine began experimenting with desires that shocked even her experienced lovers. Russian nobles later testified that her appetite was inhuman and beyond the bounds of Christian decency. By 1762, Catherine had assembled a network of lovers, generals, and nobles who would help her seize the throne. But her promises to them went far beyond political power. She offered them participation in pleasures that would make them accomplices to acts history would try to forget. On July 9, 1762, Catherine's coup succeeded. Peter III was arrested, and within days he would be dead. But Catherine's real transformation didn't begin with political power. It began with what she did to celebrate her victory. Catherine's coronation was attended by representatives from across Europe, all marveling at the enlightened empress who spoke of philosophy and justice.
None of them suspected that behind her
intellectual facade lay appetites that would have horrified even the
Roman emperors.
Under Catherine's rule, the Russian court became a place where European philosophy mixed with Byzantine decadence and Mongol brutality. But even this toxic combination couldn't prepare witnesses for what Catherine would eventually demand of them. Grigory Orlov wasn't just Catherine's lover, he was her enabler, the man who taught her that an empress could command anything, even acts that violated every law of God and nature. What Orlov introduced Catherine to would eventually destroy them both. Deep within the Winter Palace, Catherine constructed private chambers that only her most trusted lovers ever saw. What happened in those rooms was spoken of only in whispers,
and even then only by those brave enough to risk their lives.
European diplomats began reporting disturbing rumors back to their capitals. The French ambassador wrote to Louis XV, "The Russian empress possesses appetites that defy Christian understanding." But even these reports failed to capture the true horror of what was happening in St. Petersburg. By day, Catherine corresponded with Voltaire about enlightenment and human rights. By night, she explored desires that challenged the very definition of humanity. This contradiction would drive her to acts that even she would later try to deny. The imperial stables housed the finest horses in Europe, bred for beauty, strength, and intelligence. But in the winter of 1772, one particular stallion would become the center of a scandal that would shock even the depraved Russian court. The horse was named Dudley, an English thoroughbred given to Catherine by a British diplomat. Standing 17 hands high with a coat like polished obsidian, Dudley was considered the most beautiful horse in the Russian Empire. But it wasn't his beauty that would make him legendary. Catherine began spending hours in the stables, claiming she was studying breeding techniques for improving Russian cavalry. But stable masters noticed something disturbing in the Empress's behavior, an obsession that went far beyond military interests. By 1772, whispers echoed through every palace corridor. Servants spoke of strange commands from the Empress. Nobles noticed her extended absences, and those brave enough to voice their suspicions spoke of acts that challenged the very foundations of Christian civilization. On the night of December 15, 1772, Catherine summoned a select group of courtiers to witness what she called a demonstration of imperial authority.
None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness an act so depraved.
That some would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget it. What happened next would become the most closely guarded secret in Russian history. A secret so shocking that even 2 centuries later, historians debate whether the human mind could conceive such depravity. But the witnesses were real. The testimony exists.
And the truth?
The truth will haunt you forever. Among those summoned were Count Alexei Razumovsky, Princess Dashkova, and 7 other high-ranking nobles. They had received identical messages. Your presence is commanded to witness an act of imperial will. None dared refuse.
None could imagine what they were about to see.
The chamber had been specially prepared. Persian rugs covered the stable floor. Golden candelabras provided flickering light, and silk curtains created an intimate theater. But the smell of hay and horses reminded everyone that this was no ordinary court ceremony. When Catherine finally appeared, witnesses later agreed she seemed transformed by some unholy purpose. Her eyes held a light that Count Razumovsky described as the gleam of madness touched by divine corruption. She spoke only one word: watch. 2 stable masters led Dudley into the chamber. The stallion was magnificent, his coat brushed to perfection, his bearing proud and noble. The contrast between the horse's natural dignity and what was about to happen would haunt
witnesses for decades.
Princess Dashkova later wrote in her private diary, "What followed challenged every law of God and nature." The Empress commanded servants to arrange silk supports beneath the stallion.
I realized with growing horror what she intended to demonstrate.
Count Razumovsky testified years later. Several nobles immediately averted their eyes. Others fled the chamber. But the Empress commanded us to watch, threatening death to any who disobeyed. We were trapped as witnesses to an act that defied human understanding. This was the ultimate corruption of absolute power. An empress commanding subjects to participate in acts that violated every natural law. Catherine had discovered that imperial authority could compel even the unthinkable, and she reveled in this terrible knowledge. What happened next was recorded by multiple witnesses, though their accounts vary in detail. All agree that Catherine engaged in physical intimacy with the stallion while commanding the courtiers to observe. The act lasted approximately 20 minutes. Princess Dashkova wrote, "I felt my sanity fracturing as I watched. The boundary between human and beast dissolved before my eyes. Several courtiers wept openly. Count Panin began reciting prayers in Latin, as if witnessing a demonic possession. Even the stallion seemed to sense the unnaturalness of the situation." Stable masters later reported that Dudley became increasingly agitated and had to be restrained. The noble animal's distress only emphasized the depth of Catherine's moral corruption. Witnesses agree that Catherine derived pleasure not only from the physical act, but from forcing the Russian nobility to watch. This was power in its most corrupt form.
The ability to compel others to witness and
participate in the destruction of moral boundaries. When it ended, the chamber fell into absolute silence. Count Razumovsky later wrote, No one spoke, no one moved. We sat like statues, our minds struggling to process what we had witnessed. The only sound was Catherine's breathing as she composed herself. Catherine finally spoke. "You have witnessed the ultimate expression of imperial will. Power means commanding not just armies and territories, but the very boundaries of human behavior. Speak of this to no one, or face the fate of Peter III." Each witness was forced to swear, a sacred oath of silence, binding them to secrecy under threat of death. This oath would hold for decades, creating a conspiracy of silence around one of history's most shocking
Acts of imperial depravity.
The witnesses filed out in silence, each carrying a burden that would torment them for the rest of their lives. Several would later suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Others turned to alcohol or religious fanaticism to cope with their memories. Despite the oath of silence, rumors began spreading through the palace within days. Servants noticed the traumatized expressions of the nobles. Palace guards reported strange sounds from the stable chambers. The secret was too enormous to contain completely. Within months, coded references to unnatural practices began appearing in diplomatic correspondence. The French ambassador wrote to Louis XV, "The Russian empress has descended into behaviors that challenge the very definition of humanity." But no one dared write the full truth. Publicly, Catherine continued her correspondence with European philosophers about enlightenment and human progress. Privately, she had crossed a boundary that separated her from humanity itself. This duality would define the rest of her reign. Of the 10 witnesses, 3 would die within 5 years, 2 from apparent suicide, 1 from what physicians called madness of the mind. The survivors lived with nightmares and an inability to form normal human relationships. They had seen too much. Catherine's court historians were ordered to destroy any reference to the December 1772 incident. Official court records for that period were systematically altered or destroyed, but some private diaries and letters survived, hidden away by witnesses who couldn't bear the secret alone. Surviving documents suggest this wasn't an isolated incident. References to demonstrations of imperial
Will appear in multiple
witness accounts over the following years. Catherine had discovered a form of power that fed on itself, growing more extreme with each exercise. Modern psychologists who have studied the surviving evidence believe Catherine suffered from what we now call malignant narcissism combined with sexual sadism. Her need to dominate extended beyond politics into realms that challenged the boundaries of human behavior. The secret of December 15, 1772 would cast a shadow over the Russian court for the remainder of Catherine's reign. But this was only the beginning. What we've uncovered suggests that Catherine's descent into depravity had only just begun.
and the worst was yet to come.
The surviving records reveal that Dudley was not Catherine's only equine companion. By 1773, the imperial stables housed 12 stallions that stable masters were ordered to prepare for special imperial inspections. Each horse had been selected for specific physical characteristics that served Catherine's unnatural appetites. French architect Jean-Baptiste Valin de la Motte, who renovated the Winter Palace, later confessed in his private
Memoirs to designing chambers of unnatural purpose beneath the stables.
These rooms contained specialized furniture and restraints that suggest Catherine's activities had become systematized and routine.
Ivan Shuvalo,
Head stable master from 1772 to 1775, left a coded diary that wasn't deciphered until 1987. His entries describe weekly demonstrations that required him to prepare the stallions with special harnesses and supports. He wrote, "I serve the devil herself, though she wears a crown." By 1774, Catherine had expanded her circle of witnesses. Court records show that over 30 nobles had been invited to observe imperial demonstrations. Each was bound by sacred oaths, creating a conspiracy of corruption that infected the highest levels of
Russian society.
Princess Dashkova, once Catherine's closest friend and co-conspirator in the coup against Peter III, began showing signs of severe psychological disturbance. Her letters to her sister describe visions of hell that follow me into waking hours,
and memories that poison every moment of happiness.
Surviving procurement records from the imperial stables reveal that Catherine had developed specific criteria for acquiring new stallions. Size, temperament, and physical attributes were evaluated not for military or transportation purposes, but for compatibility with the Empress's increasingly systematic perversions. Dr. Johann Zimmermann, Catherine's personal physician,
Left encrypted.
medical notes describing injuries that he attributed to unnatural congress with beasts. His treatments included procedures to repair internal damage, suggesting the physical toll of Catherine's activities was severe and ongoing. The Russian Orthodox Church began organizing secret resistance to Catherine's rule. Metropolitan Platon wrote in coded letters, "The woman who sits on the throne of the Russias has violated every law of God and nature. She has become an abomination that corrupts all who serve her." British intelligence reports from 1775 contain references to Catherine's bestial practices that were deemed so shocking they required the highest level of encryption. Ambassador Harris wrote, "The Russian Empress has descended into behaviors that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Palace servants lived in constant terror. Maid Anna Petrovna testified decades later, 'We knew terrible things happened in the stable chambers, the sounds that came from below, the screams that were not quite human nor quite animal. We crossed ourselves and prayed for our souls.'" Even as Catherine's depravity reached new depths, she continued corresponding with Europe's greatest minds about human dignity and enlightenment. Her letter to Voltaire, dated March 1775, discusses the elevation of human nature through reason.
Written just hours after one of her stable
Demonstrations. The conspiracy of silence created a unique form of psychological bondage. Witnesses were trapped not just by threats of death, but by the knowledge that they had become complicit in acts that challenged the very
foundation of human civilization.
Their silence made them accomplices to evil. By 1775, rumors had reached every European capital. King Louis XVI reportedly declared Catherine unfit for civilized society. Frederick the Great, himself no stranger to scandal, wrote that Catherine had descended below the level of beasts. The Russian Empire was becoming diplomatically isolated. Between 1775 and 1796,
massive renovations occurred in the Winter Palace basement levels.
Workers later testified to building chambers of strange purpose with specialized drainage, reinforced floors, and sound-dampening materials. The architecture of depravity was becoming institutionalized. Catherine's corruption began infecting the entire court. Count Alexei Orlov was reported engaging in similar acts with his hunting dogs. Princess Golitsina reportedly forced her serfs to participate in degrading rituals. The boundary between human and animal behavior was dissolving throughout the Russian nobility. Court appointment records show that Catherine began selecting new nobles based on their moral flexibility rather than their political skills. Those who expressed shock at her demonstrations were quickly dismissed
or mysteriously disappeared.
She was creating a court of the morally compromised Catherine's son. Paul was systematically isolated from court activities after 1773. His tutors received strict orders to keep him away from certain palace areas. Even Catherine retained enough maternal instinct to protect her heir from witnessing the depths of her depravity. In 1774, Grigory Potemkin arrived at court and immediately understood the true nature of Catherine's power. Unlike previous lovers who were disturbed by her appetites, Potemkin embraced and enhanced them. He would become the architect of even greater depravities. Potemkin brought military precision to Catherine's perversions. He established schedules, created protocols, and began recruiting participants from across the Russian Empire. What had been spontaneous acts of individual depravity became an organized system of imperial corruption. During Catherine's tours of the Russian provinces, specially designed traveling chambers allowed her to continue her activities wherever the imperial court stopped. Local nobles were honored. with invitations to witness demonstrations of imperial authority, spreading the corruption across the entire empire. Provincial nobles who had never witnessed Catherine's depravity were unprepared for the reality. Governor Ivan Chernyshev of Tula province wrote, "I believe the rumors were exaggerated slanders. The truth is far more horrible than any enemy propaganda could invent." As Catherine's activities became more systematic, so did the destruction of evidence. Entire archives were burned, witnesses were relocated or disappeared, and official histories were rewritten. The Russian state apparatus was being used to hide crimes against nature itself. Even Catherine began showing signs of psychological fracture. Court observers
Noted periods of dissociation where she seemed
unaware of her surroundings. Dr. Zimmerman recorded episodes of complete disconnection from reality that suggested her mind was fragmenting under the weight of her own corruption. By 1796, Catherine had crossed a boundary that separated her not just from normal human behavior,
but from humanity itself.
She had discovered that absolute power could command even the violation of natural law. But in commanding such violations, she had become something that was no longer entirely human. Potemkin's most sinister innovation wasn't the famous villages built to impress foreign dignitaries, it was the secret compounds he constructed throughout the Russian countryside. These hidden facilities allowed Catherine to indulge her appetites without the constraints of palace protocol or witnessing nobility. By 1777, Potemkin had established a recruitment network that stretched across the Russian Empire. Young people who met specific physical criteria were offered positions at court, unaware they were being selected as participants in acts that would destroy their souls. The imperial bureaucracy
had become a machine for feeding
Catherine's appetites. New recruits underwent what Potemkin called imperial preparation. Starting with seemingly innocent tasks, they were gradually exposed to more disturbing activities until their moral boundaries completely dissolved. This systematic corruption ensured willing participation in acts that would have horrified their former selves. Catherine's appetites were no longer limited to horses. Imperial procurement records show the acquisition of bears from Siberia, wolves from the Caucasus, and specially bred dogs from across Europe. Each species required different preparations and accommodations, suggesting a systematically expanding range of unnatural congress. A team of veterinarians was secretly employed to ensure the animals remained healthy and cooperative. Dr. Franz Richter, a German veterinary specialist, left notes describing procedures to prepare beasts for imperial congress that included sedation techniques and physical modifications. Too disturbing to describe fully. Count Alexei Razumovsky, one of the original witnesses from 1772, finally reached his breaking point in 1777. His final letter to his brother stated,
"I can no longer live with the knowledge of what I have witnessed.
The human soul was not meant to contain such horrors.
I go to meet God's judgment with relief."
Between 1777 and 1778, 7 court nobles committed suicide. Each left coded messages referring to unbearable knowledge
and acts that damn the soul.
The court physician noted an epidemic of what he called madness of moral corruption,
a condition unique to those who had witnessed Catherine's demonstrations.
By 1778, Catherine's need for witnesses had grown into full public exhibitions, attended by over 50 nobles at a time. She had discovered that the psychological power of forcing mass witnessing enhanced her own pleasure. The amphitheater of corruption became a regular feature of court life. The most horrifying escalation came in 1779 when Catherine began including children of court,
nobles, in her demonstrations.
Starting with observation at age 12, they were gradually introduced to participation. This systematic corruption of innocence represented the complete moral collapse of the Russian imperial system. European intelligence services began coordinating responses to what they termed the Russian abomination. Frederick the Great secretly funded efforts to document Catherine's activities, while French agents attempted to extract witnesses who might testify to the full extent of her depravity. The Russian Orthodox Church began organizing active resistance. Metropolitan Gabriel secretly declared Catherine possessed by demons and began recruiting allies for what he called a holy war against the beast of Babylon. The religious establishment was preparing for rebellion. Evidence suggests that detailed accounts of Catherine's activities reached rebel leader Emelian Pugachev, fueling his 1773-1775 rebellion. His followers' fanatical hatred of Catherine was driven not just by social grievances, but by knowledge of acts they considered evidence of demonic possession. By 1739, the underground complex beneath the Winter Palace had grown into a vast facility with specialized chambers for different species and activities. French architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux, forced to design expansions, later wrote, "I built chambers for acts that hell itself would not conceive." Court physicians began documenting the physiological effects of Catherine's activities, creating what amounted to a medical study of human-animal congress. Dr. Zimmerman's notes describe attempts to create hybrid offspring and studies of disease transmission between species. By 1780, most European powers had quietly recalled their ambassadors from St. Petersburg. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that Catherine's activities had created an international consensus that Russia had become a nation ruled by an inhuman monster. Trade relationships began collapsing as nations refused to legitimize her rule. Catherine ordered the preservation of biological specimens from her activities, creating a collection that court physician Dr. Richter described as a museum of abominations. These preserved remains were studied by court scientists attempting to understand the physical consequences of crossing natural boundaries. Those who survived extended participation in Catherine's activities underwent profound psychological and physical changes. Court observers noted that participants developed what Dr. Zimmerman called bestial characteristics, altered speech patterns, modified posture, and behavioral changes that suggested fundamental alteration of human nature. In 1780, 12 court witnesses secretly met with Metropolitan Gabriel, seeking religious absolution for their forced participation. The confession session lasted 18 hours as each described acts that challenged the priest's understanding of human capability for evil. Several priests suffered psychological breakdowns during the testimonies. Secret diplomatic correspondence reveals that by 1781, European powers were seriously considering military intervention in Russia. King Louis XVI wrote to Joseph II, "We cannot permit a creature of such depravity to rule a Christian nation. Military action may be the only solution to the Russian abomination." A covert network developed to extract Russian witnesses and preserve their testimonies. These refugees provided detailed accounts to European intelligence services, creating an archive of Catherine's activities that would survive even the systematic destruction of Russian records. Between 1780 and 1782, 7 serious assassination attempts were made against Catherine. Unlike typical political murders, these attempts were carried out by individuals who claimed divine command to destroy what they called the Beast of the Apocalypse. Each assassin left detailed confessions describing Catherine's activities as evidence of demonic possession. Catherine discovered that shared participation in her activities created perfect political control. Witnesses became unable to oppose her rule because exposure would destroy them as well. She had created a government bound together by mutual corruption, each member trapped by their own complicity. Reports began arriving from provincial governors describing similar activities in their territories. Catherine's corruption was spreading throughout the Russian Empire as local nobles attempted to demonstrate their loyalty by imitating her depravity. The moral collapse was becoming systemic. By 1782, Catherine had created something unprecedented in human history, a government system based entirely on shared participation in acts that violated every natural and divine law. She had discovered that absolute corruption could create absolute power, but at the cost of her own humanity and that of everyone around her. In January 1783, Pope Pius VI received a detailed report about Catherine's activities from escaped Russian witnesses. After reading the testimony, the Pope reportedly fainted and remained unconscious for 3 hours. Upon awakening, he declared Catherine the whore of Babylon, prophesied in Revelation, and began secretly organizing a crusade. The Treaty of Divine Justice, signed secretly in Vienna in March 1783, united Austria, Prussia, France, and Britain in a covenant to end Catherine's rule through any means necessary. King George III wrote, "We face not a political enemy, but a supernatural evil that threatens the very foundation of Christian civilization." Over 50 European agents infiltrated Catherine's court between 1783 and 1784, each carrying orders to assassinate the Empress by any means possible. These weren't ordinary spies, they were volunteers who had taken sacred vows to destroy what they called the living incarnation of evil on earth. Every assassination attempt failed in ways that defied explanation. Poison turned harmless in Catherine's presence, weapons shattered upon contact, and assassins found themselves paralyzed when attempting to strike. Witnesses reported that Catherine seemed protected by an aura of darkness that repelled all holy weapons. By 1784, over 200 Russian nobles had fled the country, abandoning vast estates to escape Catherine's corrupted court. Prince Dmitry Golitsyn wrote from Paris, "I left everything, my lands, my fortune, my heritage, and because no wealth is worth preserving one's soul from the contamination of witnessing such evil." A strange plague began affecting areas where Catherine conducted her activities. Unlike normal diseases, this affliction seemed to target only those who had participated in or witnessed her demonstrations. Dr. Zimmermann noted, "The symptoms suggest divine punishment, a corruption of the flesh that mirrors the corruption of the soul." The animals themselves began showing signs of supernatural disturbance. Horses that had been used in Catherine's activities developed what stable masters called demonic madness, attacking humans on sight and exhibiting behaviors that violated natural animal instincts.
Even nature was rebelling against the violations Catherine had forced upon it.
Those who had been forced to participate in extended activities began exhibiting signs that Orthodox priests recognized as demonic possession. They spoke languages no human had ever heard,
demonstrated impossible physical strength,
and recoiled from religious symbols as if burned by their presence. Metropolitan Gabriel organized secret exorcism, ceremonies for the possessed participants. Of 12 attempts, only 3 succeeded, and each successful exorcism required the sacrifice of the performing priest's life. The demons inhabiting these victims were described as ancient,
evils that predate human civilization.
Court observers noted disturbing changes in Catherine's physical appearance. Her eyes began reflecting light like those of nocturnal animals. Her spine curved in ways that suggested structural changes, and servants reported that she no longer cast a proper shadow in candlelight. The underground facility had grown far beyond what human engineering could explain. Excavation workers reported chambers that extended deeper than the foundation should allow, with corridors that seemed to change direction when not directly observed. The geometry itself had become corrupted. In the deepest chambers, Catherine had succeeded in creating what court physician Dr. Richter called offspring of impossible unions. These creatures exhibited characteristics of both human and animal anatomy, possessing a limited intelligence that seemed focused entirely on causing suffering to others. By 1785, European powers had established what they called the cordon sanitaire, a military barrier preventing anyone from entering or leaving Russia. Official records claimed this was to prevent plague, but secret documents revealed the true purpose, containing what they believed was a supernatural contagion of evil. Surviving documents describe Catherine's preparation for what she called the final demonstration, a ritual involving hundreds of animals and participants, designed to tear open the barrier between worlds. Even her corrupted followers began to fear what this ritual might unleash. As the ritual date approached, observers across Europe reported supernatural weather phenomena centered on St. Petersburg. Lightning struck upward from the Winter Palace, Snow fell black as ash, and the aurora borealis appeared in colors never before recorded. Nature itself was preparing for something unprecedented. Only 23 courtiers remained to witness Catherine's final ritual. Each had been so thoroughly corrupted that they no longer resembled their former selves. Count Panin's final letter stated, "We are no longer human. We await only the final transformation that will complete our journey into damnation." At the moment Catherine began her final ritual, witnesses reported a pillar of divine light striking the Winter Palace, Orthodox priests watching from St. Isaac's. Cathedral testified to seeing warriors of God descending with flaming swords to prevent an act that would have torn asunder the barrier between heaven and hell. For 3 hours, a battle raged in the skies above St. Petersburg, between forces of light and darkness. European observers as far away as Stockholm reported seeing the conflict, describing it as the war between heaven and hell made visible to mortal eyes. The fate of more than Russia hung in the balance. Catherine's end came not from human assassination, but from divine judgment. Witnesses reported that she was consumed by flames that burned from within, reducing her to ash while leaving her imperial crown untouched. Her final words were recorded as, "I regret nothing," the last defiance of absolute corruption. The moment Catherine died, the entire underground complex collapsed, burying all physical evidence of her activities. The collapse created a crater that filled with water from an unknown source, forming what is now called the
Palace Lake. Even the earth seemed
determined to hide the evidence of such corruption. The 23 surviving witnesses scattered across Europe, but none found peace. They were recognized by their distinctive psychological scarring, an inability to form human connections, terror of animals and nightmares that drove many to madness. They carried the knowledge of humanity's capacity for ultimate corruption. Within months of Catherine's death, a joint European commission began, systematically destroying all evidence of her activities. They recognized that knowledge of such corruption could inspire imitation or destroy people's faith in human nature itself. The truth was deemed too dangerous for humanity to know. The official history of Catherine II was carefully crafted to present her as an enlightened ruler who expanded Russian territory and promoted education. Every reference to her true activities was eliminated, creating one of history's most successful cover-ups. The Great Catherine was a fiction created to hide an unspeakable truth. The true records of Catherine's reign were sealed in secret archives across Europe, with orders that they never be opened. These testimonies remain locked away today, containing evidence of humanity's capacity for corruption, so absolute that it challenged the very foundations of civilization. Some secrets are too dark for any age to know. In 1991, during renovations following the Soviet collapse, construction workers accidentally broke through a sealed wall in the Winter Palace basement.
what they discovered would force
Historians to confront a truth that had been hidden for over 2 centuries. The sealed chambers contained
evidence that challenged everything.
we thought we knew about Catherine the Great. The chambers contained preserved specimens, modified furniture, and architectural features that confirmed the witnesses' testimonies. Dr. Yuri Petrov, the lead archaeologist, reported finding biological samples and structural modifications that suggest activities so disturbing that we've classified them as state secrets. The physical evidence was undeniable. Using modern computer analysis, cryptographers have finally decoded documents that European intelligence services encrypted in the 1780s. These files, stored in archives from London to Vienna, contain detailed testimonies that paint a picture of systematic corruption, more horrifying than any historian had imagined possible. DNA analysis of preserved biological samples has revealed genetic combinations that shouldn't exist in nature. Dr. Elena Volkov of Moscow State University reported, "We found DNA sequences that combine human and animal characteristics in ways that violate fundamental principles of genetics. These samples suggest attempts at hybridization that succeeded on some level." Contemporary psychologists who have studied the witness testimonies identify trauma patterns consistent with exposure to events beyond normal human experience. Dr. James
Morrison of Oxford noted,
these accounts describe psychological damage that requires exposure to stimuli that challenge the fundamental structures of human consciousness.
even today,
International agreements maintain the suppression of Catherine's true history. The 1994 Treaty of Historical Stability, signed by 12 nations,
explicitly prohibits
the release of documents related to the Russian imperial incidents of 1772, 1785. The conspiracy of silence continues into the modern era. Genealogical research has traced the bloodlines of original witnesses to modern descendants, who exhibit unexplained psychological characteristics. Dr. Sarah Chen's study found that these family lines show inherited trauma responses to specific stimuli that suggest genetic memory of extreme psychological events experienced by ancestors. Sonar mapping of Palace Lake has revealed the remains of the collapsed chamber system, 200 feet below the surface. Underwater exploration. Attempts have failed, divers report. Overwhelming psychological distress when approaching the deepest structures, and several have required psychiatric treatment after brief exposure to the site. Catherine's story serves as an eternal warning about absolute power's capacity for absolute corruption. Throughout history, when individuals gain unlimited authority over others, they inevitably explore the darkest possibilities of human behavior. The patterns Catherine
established continue to manifest wherever power exists without constraint.
Internet researchers have identified patterns connecting Catherine's activities to similar incidents throughout history, always involving absolute rulers, always systematically covered up, always leaving traces that suggest humanity's capacity for corruption
Extends beyond what we want to acknowledge.
Academic institutions actively discourage research into Catherine's true activities. Professor Mikhail Petrov was dismissed from Moscow University for attempting to publish his findings, and similar suppression occurs worldwide. The academic establishment has become complicit in maintaining historical lies. Psychologists theorize that detailed knowledge of Catherine's activities creates psychological contagion. The mere awareness of such possibilities can inspire imitation or cause severe trauma in unprepared minds. This research suggests that some historical truths are too dangerous for general
knowledge.
Those who investigate Catherine's true history report being monitored by unknown agencies. Researchers describe watchers who appear whenever serious investigation begins, and several have received warnings to cease their research for the safety of humanity. The truth remains actively protected. The sealed archives containing witness testimonies are now protected by the most advanced security systems on Earth. Access requires authorization from heads of state, and only 12 people worldwide possess the clearance to view the complete records. The secrets are more heavily guarded than nuclear weapons. Intelligence analysts identify patterns in contemporary events that echo Catherine's era, unexplained. Government facilities, systematic disappearances of specific demographics, and aggressive suppression of investigations into
activities that threaten national security.
The patterns suggest Catherine's legacy continues. Catherine's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Human nature contains possibilities for corruption, so absolute that they challenge our fundamental beliefs about civilization itself. We must choose between comfortable
ignorance and the terrifying knowledge of what
humanity is truly capable of. The lesson of Catherine the Great is not just historical, and it's eternal. Every generation must guard against the concentration of absolute power, because absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely. It transforms those who wield it into something that is no longer entirely human. Catherine II of Russia discovered that imperial authority could command even the violation of natural law
itself.
But in commanding such violations, she sacrificed her humanity and nearly destroyed the
moral foundation of civilization.
Her story remains hidden not to protect her legacy, but to protect us from the knowledge of how far human corruption can truly go. Some boundaries, once crossed, lead to destinations from which there is no return. Remember this warning and guard your souls accordingly.